The objectives for this CEU, based on this research article, are to continue discussing identify, explain the operational definition of burnout, explain burnout from a conceptually systematic perspective as a process or spectrum, discuss function-related definitions of burnout and how they can be individualized. I just named like 3 objectives right there. I'm not sure what number we're on. What was the other objective that we covered? Discuss how there are different antecedents and different consequences related to burnout. So functionally, there can be several different burnout-related behaviors across individuals. Those are the objectives that we covered. By the end of listening to this episode, gossiping with me about the research, you will be able to explain and answer all of these objectives. Hello and welcome to Research Gossip. Let's gossip together about research in the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management. The article we will be discussing today is called The Present and Future Status of Stress Research by Ronald J. Burke from 1987, an oldie but a goodie. If you would like to earn CEUs for listening to this episode, there will be a code word dropped in randomly, and you can find the link on my website to enter the code word, and then we will take the steps for you to receive a continuing education unit. Let's start with the abstract. Rumor has it 5 research thrusts. Okay. 5 research thrusts were identified in current stress research. Replications and extensions of ISR's work environment and health model, type A behavior, psychological burnout, social support, and the work-non-work interface. However, 1 or more limitations were noted in stress research methodology, which limited the value of much of this work. Yikes, called out in the abstract. In addition to addressing these shortcomings, future stress researchers are encouraged to employ longitudinal designs. Yeah, we would love that. Who has time for that? And include measures of physiological symptoms. Ooh, I like that. Tell me more. Stress researchers should concentrate on stress as a process. Cool. Blue and pink collar workers. Okay. Work stress of women. Sex differences in stress dynamics and the work, family, and societal interface. In addition, bridging the gap between the procedures and consumers of stress research findings would achieve better informed research and practice. So we're talking about that research practice gap, which needs to be discussed. Although occupational stress has become a central variable in OB research, which is organizational behavior, which is different from organizational behavior management, our understanding of stress phenomena remains rather limited. Yep, still does, even like 30 years from now. Increases in understanding will continue to come slowly. I think this author really predicted the future for us. All right, so in this article, there were particular components that I was focusing on, which were the components where they were talking about occupational burnout. Essentially, this author, from my understanding, was reviewing organizational behavior research on stress and essentially like giving their 2 cents and saying like how organizational behavior management research could expand upon what they currently have found, which are surprisingly, not surprisingly, very similar conclusions that current burnout research in organizational behavior management and behavior analysis are making today. So a challenge that they brought up was examining the meaning and phenomenon of the stress experience and the validity of measures in the hope of standardizing diagnostic instruments. Now, stress and burnout are different. Stress, as we've discussed, can be good in the body, and there's a difference between acute stress and chronic stress, which the author does discuss in this article. And then there's a difference between acute stress, chronic stress, and burnout. Research shows that chronic stress that has not been, quote, successfully managed does lead to burnout. So as I was reading this, the author was specifically talking about stress and not burnout, but I was thinking about what they were saying through a lens of burnout, and I think that their recommendations and their insight could be valuable to be applied in the same way when we're talking about burnout research. So talking about burnout as an experience, talking about burnout as a spectrum and as an outcome, and finding measures that are valid in terms of it from a behavior analytic perspective, which would mean more direct measures of burnout related behaviors, and including, as a radical behaviorist would, both physiological symptoms, but also direct measurement and observation and indirect measures of burnout-related behaviors. He states that, we need to be noting when we're studying stress, whether it is acute versus chronic, which I think that advice is very valuable for burnout research as well. And some of the limitations, some of the problems that they think should be studied include the difference between acute versus chronic states of stress. So I translated that into, the spectrum of burnout. Everybody's burnout looks different. The role of the objective and subjective environment, radical behaviorism, thank you, B.F. Skinner. The relationship between physiological strain and psychological mechanisms. Okay, some of that might be out of our scope, but that's okay. Coping behaviors, job crafting, protective factors, maybe. And the work, family, and social interface. And my understanding of this article when the author is talking about the work, family, social interface is essentially talking about, we need to be paying attention to invisible tasks that have to be done but that are not recognized or are not part of compensation in terms of in the workplace or in terms of personal life. And these stereotypically are done by women. And we also know, which this article mentions, which I love that they called it out, a lot of research is focused only using men participants, but then is applied to also suggest that women have the same outcomes. And we know that this is not true. Women are under-researched. They're underrepresented in research. And that is an issue in itself. The objective of this article, the main point of why they were doing this, was to just talk about the current status of stress research and determine if there were any recommendations or suggestions on the future status of stress research. So they talk about increasing interest in occupational stress, and then they talk about current stress research content, and they mention the investigations of burnout in work settings, which are included in their stress research, which is what I focused on, of course. So they cite Chernis, 1980, and Maslow, 1982, of course, as the pioneers at this time of talking about burnout specifically in work settings, because there is such thing as burnout in personal settings. There's such thing as parental burnout. The research shows the research has labeled parental burnout, autistic burnout, personal burnout. I'm not sure the exact term in the research, but essentially not occupational burnout. The author for this article is strictly talking about occupational burnout, which is my research scope and what I was the most interested in when I was reviewing this article. Something else that they mention as an area of research focus that I think is so important, but I still don't really know how to navigate from a researcher's perspective versus a practitioner's perspective, is they talk about examining the way in which work stress and life stress influence each other both at individual levels and organizational outcomes. So I like how we're taking a behavioral systems analysis approach by looking at the individual level and the organizational level. However, from a research perspective, it makes sense to be interested and curious and thoughtful about work stress and life stress and being able to document those things and see how they're related. But from a practitioner's perspective, as a professional, as an employee, I don't know that I would feel comfortable sharing my life stress and implying or being open and vulnerable to the idea that my life stress could negatively impact my work and my work stress, even though it does. I'm not sure I would be willing to share that. And I also question, where's the boundary between, an employee having their personal life protected? So I'm not really sure how to navigate that from a practitioner perspective, but I think from a research perspective, we at least need to account for it. Even if we end up deciding that it's not something that there needs to be privacy around that and that privacy will be protected, it's something that we need to note that is occurring as a extraneous variable. So it's a variable that could impact research on stress, whether it's acute or chronic, and burnout. But it's not something that we can necessarily control for. So it's something that we need to, the research would recommend we either have to hold it constant or recognize that it will be there no matter what we do and account for it and be honest that it is there. Then the authors talk about work stress and individual well-being and bringing those two concepts together as the kind of work stress being the antithesis of individual well-being. And then they start talking about psychological burnout in work settings. This is the juicy tea that I was the most curious about. So this article was written in 1987. So the Maslow definition of burnout, chronic stress that has not been successfully managed, emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, lack of personal accomplishment, was not as popular as it is now. So they talk about the broadest definition of burnout, which I had never stumbled upon, so I was very excited about this, by Friedenberger in 1980. They equate burnout with stress, connect burnout with an endless list of adverse health and well-being variables, and suggest it is caused by the relentless pursuit of success. Okay. Not sure if I align with that, but I think it was exciting for me as a researcher to find a older definition of burnout other than the Maslow definition, because honestly I thought that was the first one. Other more narrow definitions the author mentions focusing on human service professionals with interpersonal stress as the cause of burnout, from Maslow and Jackson, 1981, that says emotional burnout is related to feelings experienced by people whose jobs require repeated exposure to emotionally charged interpersonal situations. This is from Maslow, 1982. So this is before they had further defined their definition of burnout, occupational burnout in health and human service settings. So after the author gives a, review of where stress and burnout research currently is, now we're getting into their recommendations. So they say, as recommended by previous authors, divide the work environment into internal and external variables and categorize them in specific ways in order to develop a model of psychological burnout to follow. I like this idea in the sense of radical behaviorism, and again, whether or not we are asking humans to be vulnerable in this way and share their internal variables that may be impacting burnout, addressing that they are present, maybe having some sort of indirect way to, of course, it'll be an indirect measure no matter what, so we don't even have to fight that. But having some anonymity behind it in terms of, are you experiencing internal physiological symptoms of burnout, which could include blah, 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 and have it be yes or no. Have it be a discrete categorization, so some type of nominal coding for those individuals, so it could be any one of those things and they don't necessarily have to share which ones. So I like this. I think this is a good recommendation because I think it's important for us to be categorizing internal and external variables when it comes to burnout. As a researcher, as a practitioner, do I think this is easy and necessarily practical? No, I could see a lot of barriers behind this. My first question is, who's doing this, if not a researcher who's being paid to do it? And how are they building rapport quickly and efficiently with these employees and having them share this information? And also, we have this whole dilemma of, if the organization, hires a researcher or a consultant to do this work, the organization is asking the employees to divulge this information, and there's reactivity behind that, of course, because people care about their jobs, especially working in health and human service settings. There may be more of a motivation to falsify their burnout levels because they want to stay with their clients. They want to work with their clients. They've developed this relationship with the services that they're providing to other humans. The only comprehensive model that when this article was written in 1987 for burnout was from Chernus in 1980. So the model proposes that individuals with particular career orientations and extra work support and demands interact with particular work setting characteristics. So they talk about how there are different ways and strategies for active problem solving and coping when people have negative attitude changes. Again, don't love that wording, but hey, we have to start somewhere. And Chernus says that burnout occurs over time, which we know that this is true, but I don't feel like we talk about it like it's true. This is a process. Burnout is a process and represents one way of adapting to or coping with particular sources of stress. So I was excited about, it's hard to say, I'm excited about burnout research. It's sad to think about from a practitioner's perspective. It's a little dark to think about, but in terms of finding solutions and really helping individuals, we have to figure out what burnout actually is and how to measure it and how to define it and then how to provide resources. So I was talking to Jackie, my colleague Jackie Noto, and I we were interviewing Sean, Will, and Masa. They are two incredible behavior analysts, and they do amazing work. And we were having a conversation about the definition of burnout, a behavior analytic definition, and Sean brought up this idea, and I've also heard Dr. Caitlin Goki talk about this idea of thinking about burnout so for Dr. Caitlin Goki, she's the one who discussed the idea of burnout being a form of learned helplessness and thinking about it from that lens. And then Sean Will was talking about thinking about burnout in terms of degrees of freedom. So there are no degrees of freedom when you experience burnout, which essentially both types of definitions, both ways of defining burnout in those ways, are a result of lacking reinforcement in the environment, employees not contacting reinforcement in the environment. And I think that is the most accurate and the most conceptually systematic way to define burnout from what we know in the research and also from what employees share as they experience as practitioners. But I think it's hard to include how long? We don't have a DSM-5 where we can say if you've been experiencing burnout all day, every day, consistently for 2 weeks, you've been burnt out. It's not like that. It's a functional, individualized. It's an individualized process, and we have to have a functionalized definition. So I like that this is stated in the research that burnout is a process. It is a process. It occurs over time. Chronic stress is stress that exists consistently over a long period of time. How long? I'm not sure. Would that measure be helpful for practitioners? I think so. How would we do that? I'm not sure exactly, but the idea is that it's not cookie cutter. It's not the same for everyone, and that's what I think is fruitful from this research. They did talk about how Chernis used his model, which I'm a little unclear on what that model is, but I need to review that research. So Chernis' model in his study of burnout, he utilized men and women in police work and teaching. I thought that was cool. Taking research and actually applying it to individuals working in health and human service settings, including males and females in 1987, I love that. I think that's really, really amazing. And essentially the research that he did support his model of burnout. So then the authors discuss examining progressive phases of burnout. And these authors, Golombisky and his colleagues in 1984, 1986, and 1981 proposed the existence of 8 progressive phases of burnout. So this is at a time, based on my understanding, where the MBI exists, because the next sentence is talking about how they operationalized these 8 progressive phases of burnout by using 3 scales of the MBI. They talk about the MBI, the Maslow burnout inventory, emotional exhaustion, lack of personal accomplishment, and depersonalization. Something that isn't mentioned in more current research that I think is interesting, and I kind of question if maybe the authors who do this research don't feel this way, or if it's just not mentioned anymore. But they say openly that emotional exhaustion is the most potent contributor of burnout, which I have heard that. I have read that in recent research. But they say that lack of personal accomplishment is less potent, and depersonalization was the least potent contributor to burnout. I thought that was an interesting finding. I'm not sure if I would agree with that sentiment now, but this was written a long time ago, and I think discussing the fact that burnout levels across these characteristics will be different across individuals is very, very important to make sure that we're not gaslighting or invalidating anyone's experience if they are truly experiencing workplace burnout. The next thing they mention is that recent research has compared individuals' levels of burnout in the various phases of burnout by comparing other measures, which the previous episode's article essentially did that. They used indirect measures of burnout, they used the MBI, and they also used direct measures of burnout, and they actually found some differences among burnout. So in terms of thinking about burnout as a spectrum and comparing the different phases of burnout is important, because this author says, individuals at different phases of burnout also differ on antecedents and consequences of burnout. I think this is so important. This is where I'm going to put the code word, which is individualized. Individuals at different phases of burnout also differ on antecedents and consequences of burnout. Yes, absolutely. This is how we should be teaching and disseminating and providing resources for burnout. The antecedents and consequence that you as a person are going to experience in regards to your burnout-related behaviors and the outcome of experiencing burnout will be different. It will be different. This is also particularly important when talking about the MBI score. So he's referencing that you might have different levels across the 3 characteristics. That doesn't mean that you're not experiencing burnout. Then they discuss social support and work stress. I love this. In more recent literature, researchers have shown that supervisor support is a protective factor against burnout. Protective factors are activities, behaviors that you can engage in prior to an anticipated burnout related event or after you've experienced burnout, and they can help to mitigate burnout or they can help you recover from burnout. So think about protective factors as a treasure chest. So you have a box of protective factors that are a treasure chest, and you pull out items in the treasure chest, but they're actually pieces of armor. So you pull out a protective factor from the treasure chest, and it is a piece of armor that you can wear. And then when you experience or have experienced that burnout related event, you will be able to either manage and experience that burnout event in the environment in a more resilient, for mentalistic way, a more resilient way. Be able to, a behavior analytic version of that would be, as you're wearing the armor of the protective factor, you will be able to more easily experience and contact positive reinforcement, even in an environment where burnout related behaviors or burnout related antecedents could exist. So this article, this author shares that supervisor support is actually more likely to have a direct effect on stress-strain and stress-strain relationship than coworker support and spouse support. I think this is important to note because I think it would be fascinating to research the differences between supervisor support, coworker support, and spouse support, especially because there are imbalances of power involved in those different levels of support. Then they discuss work and life stress, and then they talk about current stress research methodologies. They list 8 different methodologies, but the one that stood out to me, the seventh limitations. So they're talking about limitations. They have 8 limitations. So they're really spilling the tea. You know, they're letting us know the limitations that exist in another field's research, which I think is bold, but you know, appreciate them for doing that. And the limitation that caught my eye was them saying, this author saying, the respondents are almost always men. I'm sorry, what? In a health and human service field? Pardon me? Among BCBAs? I don't think so. With little attention given to the effects of work stress on women. Okay. Yeah, that's the T. Call it out. That's unacceptable. And they discuss more of those limitations. They highlight that psychological burnout is likely to be measured by the NBI, 1981, as of right now, when this article was written in 1987. They say another positive sign is the inclusion of organizational consequences of stress, such as absenteeism and performance. So we have some outcomes of burnout. So I think something that used to confuse me is that when I was first coding these articles, I was labeling outcomes of burnout as absenteeism and performance, which are outcomes of burnout. But burnout is also an outcome. So it's kind of complicated to think about at first. But if we are under the belief that burnout is a spectrum and that burnout is an outcome of burnout-related behaviors that are going to occur over time, then the outcome of burnout as an outcome, so the outcome of the environment of experiencing chronic stress that is unsuccessfully managed is burnout at the individual level. So the outcome at the individual level is occupational burnout. The outcomes at the organizational level include, like for this article, they are saying absenteeism and performance. So I think that's something that is worth clarifying. They talk about future stress research content, and this is where they talk about work stress of women, which I liked. I liked this. I highlighted it in pink. I said, okay, tell me more. What do you have to say about work stress in women? So he says studies of work stress have almost exclusively focused on men. call it out. However, with the dramatic rise in women's employment in recent years and their increasing visibility in non-traditional areas such as management, heck yeah, we're in management. It's not untraditional anymore. Let's go. There is a growing need for the systematic investigation of factors related to women's work stress. So he discusses how research shows there are different stressors that women and men experience. While I do agree with this, I think it's more important to focus on the fact that humans experience different stressors, and it's not just the gender differences, but I do understand what they're saying about the stereotypical stressors that women and men face due to tasks being stereotypically given to women versus men. And then as an explanation, he mentions that he shares this insight that it may be that men and women are exposed to different stressors, and the relationship between stressors and appraisal and coping and strain may be moderated by gender. Yeah, could be. And then he goes on to further give an example, which I like, where he says that previous researchers, it doesn't give me a citation here, but he says Jick and Mitz, reviewed 19 studies and concluded that women tended to report higher rates of psychological distress, and men were more prone to physical illness. I do think this type of research is valuable. Do I think it's valuable to separate as women and men? Not necessarily, but separate as people, as humans, because I think this would be very, very helpful if there was a way for us to measure and or predict the psychological distress versus physical illness. So there's a difference between psychological symptoms of burnout, aka the private events that are covert, that are occurring inside your body, nobody else can see them, versus physiological symptoms of stress and burnout, which include essentially physiological symptoms, did I say physiological? I meant to say psychosomatic. So psychosomatic symptoms of any type of private event that's occurring inside your body are a physical manifestation due to something that is happening inside your physical body that nobody else can see. So for instance, there's research showing that if you experience burnout, you could develop headaches, you could develop stomach issues. Very similar to anxiety research, how, you go to the doctor and you have stomach issues and you think there's something physically wrong with your stomach, but it's actually just anxiety, or that's what's proposed. If you have a panic attack, that is a psychosomatic symptom. It's a physical symptom. Other people can see it. It's a public behavior, but the cause of those symptoms are due to something that is happening internally in your body, in your brain. It's proposed that is related to, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, experiencing stress. Then they discuss, so he mentions, oh my gosh, he spills major tea, okay? So, hold on, I just loosened my mic. I definitely didn't mean to do that. I have lotion all over my hands, so. Okay, hopefully it'll just be here. So he says that it's important to include a measure of group coping, like social support, protective factor, and organizational coping strategies, since some research has suggested that individual coping resources do not reduce strain produced by work stress. Oh my gosh. The biggest, hottest cup of tea is that statement. I'm sorry. So you're telling me that individual coping responses are not going to reduce strain and make the work stress that I'm experiencing any less stressful? So all of this advertisement and all of these solutions and resources and recommendations that we're providing that only are at the individual level, where employee has to do something outside of work while their work environment remains the same actually is not going to have any impact on them experiencing less burnout or work stress? I'm sorry. Excuse me? Excuse me? Okay, so I think this is important that he shared this, because if this is true, then, it's really not up to the individual. And also, it's like false hope to recommend to the individual coping strategies to the employee when work stress is not changed. And therefore, I think this further supports the need for OBM in all organizations. And I'm specifically thinking about, OBM principles being applied in autism clinics, in the sense that their physical work environment is changed. How they achieve the number of billable hours, the number of clients, the number of clients, the caseload that they have, the individuals who are a part of that caseload, parent training, types of parents, types of caregivers, supervisors, how many supervisors, the structure of the sessions, how long are the sessions, how many session notes, what is the quality and quantity of all of these measures, reports, how many reports, how much time to be given to write reports, resources that are provided for direct services versus non-direct services, RBTs versus BTs, the level of resources and support that they're given for doing direct tasks, traveling for supervision. The list could go on. So based on this research, those things have to change in order for individuals to essentially escape or avoid experiencing burnout. And the individual coping responses that they can, and I'm sure they do engage in, are actually kind of fruitless unless the work environment changes. Okay, so then they talk about stress as a process. I like this idea, and I think that it could be paralleled into thinking about burnout as a process. And then I felt a little gaslit as I was reading one of the sections. They talk about work stress. Is there less there than meets the eye? ? Essentially, like, is it really that bad? Is the work stress really that bad? And I said, you're gaslighting me, sir. And essentially, they mention that job satisfaction in turn tends to be relatively an unimportant contributor to one's quality of life. And that was not from the author, that was from Brief and Hollenbeck in 1985. I don't agree with that. But I am kind of glad that they discuss this, because I do think this is also a thing. There is research. The research article that we reviewed in the previous episode, their findings from the MBI, which is the gold standard of measuring burnout, suggested that their employees were experiencing low burnout. They weren't, but that's what the research says. And I guarantee you someone reading that research is going to say, well, BCBAs aren't really that burnt out. Sorry, I don't know why I'm doing a voice. Well, BCBAs aren't really that burnt out. Here's the research that says so, without fully investigating and reading, clearly not listening to the episode that I did that showed, the MBI showed low levels of burnout, but the direct behaviors that were measured showed high levels of burnout. And this made me think of, I wrote in the notes, burnout research is behavior-based safety research. I am hoping, and I like to think about burnout research as something that behavior-based safety experts, which is a subdiscipline of OBM, could incorporate. And I think that we should be talking about burnout as behavior-based safety, because behaviors that are measured in behavior-based safety are, from my perspective, are legitimate. They're legitimized. And I don't know if burnout is as legitimized. And so I think it should be discussed as a target outcome in behavior-based safety research. And I hope to see that. They mention the physiological measures of work stress, which I think can also be applied to burnout. And again, they talk about how work stress could be conceptualized as a process, and that it should be. And it's important to include a wider array of measures for work stress research. And I think this is the same for burnout. I thought this was humorous in a, like stark way. They talk about the most obvious gaps is that there's little awareness in research findings by, I don't know why I'm saying they, it was one author, he or she, that they, well, that's why I'm saying they. There's little awareness of research findings by practitioners. Yeah, because how are practitioners supposed to access research? That's a whole nother topic. If they're a BCBA, they can access this research from the portal for free from TheABAOBMer. Little research is being undertaken to determine the effectiveness of individual level interventions. Yeah. And maybe this is me being a little biased and a little reactive, but if there's research showing that the individual level interventions are not effective, organizations will be forced to do something. And they don't want to do that. I don't know. That's me being cynical. And increasing irrelevance of work stress research for intervention and policy development. And then they talk about the research practice gap, that we should be examining the ways of doing research that are useful for both theory and practice, which I'm glad they said that. And then in the final conclusion, they kind of sum up the limitations that still exist today in regards to, at least for burnout. I'm not exactly sure for work stress and organizational behavior research. So they say the latter involves issues of definition and inferences from data collected at one point in time, small and often non-representative samples, and a wide variety of different measures of the same concepts. So this article gave me hope, and it gave me insight into a previous definition of burnout before the MBI, because in all of the articles that I coded that I have yet to code, and there are more that I have yet to code, but I have never heard the Chernus definition of burnout mentioned or cited. It is always the MBI, but then there always seems to be discussion about how the MBI is actually not, it's subjective and it's not a good measure. So it's like, okay, researchers are gossiping like, yeah, this MBI, oh, it's not great, subjective measures, like, but we're going to use it. Like, what? Why? Let's make something better. But no, I understand that it needs to be repeated in its challenges. The other thing I really appreciated from this article is the discussion on conceptualizing burnout and talking about burnout. There is an article that Bottini, Slowiak, and Kazee wrote regarding the conceptualization of burnout that I think is absolutely phenomenal, and I think it touches on kind of where this author was going in terms of thinking about burnout. And I'm also really curious if anyone is interested in having a discussion about conceptualizing burnout and the behavior analytic definition of burnout in terms of learned helplessness and in terms of degrees of freedom. And I can provide some more insight into that if that is something that you guys are interested in. Hello. Welcome to this segment, How to OBMify Your Life. Here is my example of how to OBMify your life to achieve productivity while also maintaining well-being and mitigating burnout. This is for individuals who receive a lot of emails. Disclaimer / all of these recommendations are broad in general. In order for them to be effective for you, you need to self-monitor them and assess the function of your behavior and the effect of this type of resource or change or intervention moving forward to see if it works for you, because it might not. And you might work in an occupation where you're not able to do this. With all those disclaimers being said, if this works for you, I hope it's helpful. When you have your email inbox, what I want you to do moving forward is, rather than waiting for notifications to appear haphazardly throughout the day, chaotically throughout the day. I want you to pick a cadence for when you're going to check your emails. Now, depending on how much of a priority you need to be looking at your emails, it doesn't matter if you check your email every minute. But what I don't want you to do is check your email as soon as you receive one email, and each time you receive an email, you check your inbox. I don't want you to do that. I want you to develop a cadence. So let's say you review your emails 3 times a day, and 3 times a day only. You do not keep the tab open. When you first get into work, you are going to open your email inbox tab, review your emails, answer emails as needed, and then you're going to close it and you're not going to look at it. You're not going to think about it. Again, you're going to set a timer for yourself. You are not wasting that brain space. You're going to set a timer for yourself for around lunchtime, before or after lunch, hopefully not during lunch. I know how it is, but hopefully not during your actual lunch. Reviewing your email in the middle of the day, setting a timer for the afternoon before you leave, or whenever works best for you to check your email. So you're checking your email at specific times throughout the day, depending on what works for you. You're not keeping your email open, and you are not reactively looking at your email each time you receive an email. And that's job crafting, which is using the practices of organizational behavior management to create systems in your life that allow you to experience more joy and contact positive reinforcement at work, and allow you to experience happiness and more, and be productive. So you're not sacrificing being productive for feeling good and achieving well-being, but you're not sacrificing your well-being just to be productive, using the principles of behavior analysis. Let's review the ethics codes that were discussed and that relate to this article that we just reviewed. Code 1.03, accountability. Code 1.06, maintaining competence. Code 1.10, awareness of personal biases and challenges. Code 210, collaborating with colleagues as it relates to engaging in supervisor and peer support as a protective factor to mitigate burnout. 3.01, responsibility to clients. Code 4.06, providing supervision and training as it relates to supervisor supervision is a way to enhance, is a form of social support at work, which is a protective factor of burnout, which increases the quality of services provided. Let's review the task list items that can be related to the discussion that we just had on this article. C1, create operational definitions of behavior. I scrolled past A and B. A3, explain behavior from the perspective of radical behaviorism. C8, evaluate the validity and reliability of measurement procedures. C9, select a measurement procedure to obtain representative data that accounts for the critical dimension of the behavior and environmental constraints. C12, select a measurement procedure to obtain representative procedural integrity data that accounts for relevant dimensions, for example, accuracy and dosage and environmental constraints. E3, as always, develop and maintain competence by engaging in professional development activities, for example, reading literature. That's us. Seeking consultation, establishing mentors. H4, plan for and attempt to mitigate possible unwanted effects when using reinforcement, extinction, and punishment procedures. Oh, we didn't do that. I thought it was saying mitigate any obstacles using reinforcement, extinction, and punishment. That's not what it's saying. That one's not related. But it's important. But H5, plan and attempt to mitigate possible relapses of target behavior when we're discussing burnout and stress. Absolutely. H8, collaborate with others to support and enhance client services, as we should, using supervisor support and peer support. Identify the benefits of using behavior analytic supervision, decrease levels of burnout. I1. Let's take a moment to review some of the terms that we discussed in case you are a newer behavior analyst, or sometimes we just all need a refresher. So I have the Study Notes ABA glossary pulled up. Thank you, no affiliation with them, but thank you so much because it's an awesome tool that I use all the time. A term that we discussed is antecedent, which is defined as a stimulus change that happens prior to behavior. For example, the doorbell ringing was an antecedent to the dog barking. We talked about antecedents in the sense related to risk factors regarding burnout. And then we also discussed consequences, which are something that happens as a result of something else, a stimulus change that follows the behavior of interest, which would be the burnout related behavior. The result of which would ultimately, the consequence would be burnout. The result of a behavior can either be good or bad, and might be good for one person, but aversive for another. Let's see, did we discuss any others? Did I talk about verbal operants in this episode or last? I can't remember, so I'll go ahead and say it. Elementary verbal operants are these are Skinner's 6 types of verbal operants, which include mand, tact, echoic, interverbal, textual, and transcription. I love that they gave all 6 rather than 4. Okay, let's make sure. Are there any others? We talked about reactivity, which is essentially because somebody is watching you, there is... you're not engaging in the behavior in the way you would if somebody wasn't watching when it comes to disclosing information regarding how you feel about burnout, your burnout related behaviors that are private behaviors and public behaviors. Do they have definitions for private versus public? They don't. That's okay. They have a lot. So the definition that they provide of reactivity, this happens a lot when we as BCBAs come to observe. The clients or people we are observing may behave differently because they are being reactive to our presence. Because nobody wants to lose their job because of what they said or how they engaged in a behavior. Totally get it. Self-management is a process of behavior change in which an individual attempts to modify their own behavior. Self-monitoring is the process. Thank you so much, Study Notes ABA, for making these 2 separate definitions because they're 2 separate things. Self-monitoring is the process of measuring and monitoring one's own behavior. This can sometimes produce behavior change without additional intervention, even though the person is technically just counting and recording behavior. It's amazing, isn't it? Not changing the environment in which it occurs. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks for gossiping with me today about research. Enter the code word Enter the code word in the quiz that you can find on my website to get information about how to receive CEUs for listening to this episode. Email me if you have questions or want to start a discussion regarding this article, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And I look forward to gossiping with you in the future about research. All right, let's do some admin if you are interested in obtaining a CE for listening to this podcast. I would encourage you to review the Learning CE event checklist. That is currently what I am looking at. So the first task is identify and vet the instructors. You can find my CV on LinkedIn or on my website. I am an ACE provider. I am a BCBA. I have my PhD in behavior analysis. All presentation materials, including learning objectives, syllabi, and slides. So I don't have slides, but we are reviewing a research article. All content is behavior analytic in nature. And all content is designed for certified individuals. All content is accurate, up-to-date, and consistent with best practices. This will be a 0.5 CEU, so half a CEU will be awarded, and half a CEU can be awarded per 25 minutes of instruction. There will be a method for you to receive a certificate after you input the code word, which you'll find at the end of the podcast. There are no affiliations with this podcast. I do not have an affiliation with anyone in regards to this podcast, anyone or anything. After the event, I will request your feedback, and I would love for you to provide that. I will have documentation of your CE attendance if you wish to do that, and I do have to give you the CE within 45 days, and I will be retaining and managing the event documentation. If you have any issues or questions, this is my first time doing this as well, you can email me.